I'm super glad to be at this beautiful place and talk about the work that we've been doing for the last 1.5 years. ValleyDAO's main scientific focus and the technologies that we focus on are what we call climate biotechnologies. So conventionally, biotechnology is seen as a technology focusing on human health, but there's a wide range of climate applications in the space that can really help us transition into a more sustainable future. The temperature impact that we've seen from fossil-based resources in the last 100 to 150 years has increased by around 1 to 1.5 degrees. Now, this is a highly debated topic. We actually don't know if this is going to be bad or good for us. But I think what a lot of people can agree on is that this risk is too big to not be taken seriously. Biology, the lens that we like to look at biology from at ValleyDAO is really seeing biology as a technology that we can leverage. What makes biology really interesting is that it is self-sustaining. It's sort of like almost like a perfect equilibrium where everything lives in a symbiotic relationship with everything else without harming itself. It's also atomically precise. That means that it builds itself up on atom by atom. And all of this is governed by the language of biology. So biology is speaking a certain language, and that's called DNA. And this DNA is responsible for sort of like expressing itself and building larger structures such as cells, us humans, plants, animals, and various kinds of microorganisms like bacteria, yeast, and so on. And for the last 30 years, we've become really good. I wouldn't say really good, but we've become significantly better at working with biology on the genetic code. Synthesizing and reading DNA has decreased significantly, so we can write these genetic pieces and insert them into different organisms and thus obtain new features. We've also developed more sophisticated tooling, so we can engineer these organisms with much higher precision. So CRISPR, for example, is a great example of this that a lot of people are aware of. And finally, with automation, we can have a much higher scientific output, do many more experiments, and then find the perfect experimental conditions for a biological system to operate. And there's a silent renaissance of sustainable products that are currently happening. A lot of these are still in, I would say, the prototype phase, but they're becoming cheaper and cheaper to produce. A great example is Biomason, which I will go a bit deeper into later, how they actually work. But they've been able to use a naturally occurring organism to produce carbon-neutral cement. There's also companies developing animal-free meats that are one-to-one replicas of the actual thing without harming any animals. Companies making sustainable textiles such as bolt threads using mycelium to make something that looks like leather, feels like leather, almost indistinguishable. And then actually more interesting niched applications that we haven't seen before. A plant that can purify your indoor air from volatile organic compounds and turn it into pure air. So giving you an example here with Biomason, so what they've done is that they've isolated this naturally occurring microorganism that if you've ever dug a hole or just dug into the ground or playing in a sandbox, sometimes you can find like these small rock-like formations that almost sort of look like a coral reef. And these organisms, they naturally produce these calcium precipitates to enrich the soil, for example. So what they learned is that they could isolate this microorganism, put it in a lab environment, mix it with gravel and sand, and then it would start aggregating larger particles and turn it into something that looks like cement, essentially. It has the same properties, same features, and it's all carbon neutral. Another great example is LanzaTech, who in a similar process are using something called acetogenic bacteria to convert carbon dioxide into jet fuels and other chemicals. And I believe we're just scratching the surface of these different applications, and there's a huge market opportunity as well, given that we are constantly running out, or we will be running out from fossil-based resources at some point. So what this presents really is like turning climate change into an opportunity to really rethink our whole manufacturing ecosystems. Now, all of these technologies require a lot of initial funding, a lot of equipment, a lot of specialized expertise. So most of them, you'll find all of them come from different academic labs. And what we believe at ValleyDAO is the fastest way to get these from lab to solution or the fastest way to solve these climate challenges is to accelerate how fast we can bring them from lab to solution. And what we've been doing for the last 2 years is experimenting with decentralized science funding models and tokenization of research intellectual property to see if we can accelerate the pace of how fast academics can receive funding. Now, back in when I was working at the Novo Nordisk funded incubator program, I got the chance to work with a lot of entrepreneurial academics that were commercializing their research. And when we polled them and asked them, what have been the most significant factors that have influenced, the success of your research and bringing it out from academia, the two main things were funding, so translational funding that could be provided to them to improve their proof of concept that they've already developed. And the second aspect was having access to a network. Now, the current funding paradigm is that in the early stages of a technology, let's say when it's still an idea, there's a lot of funding available for that, such as from governments or philanthropic grants and so on. And so scientists receive these funding tranches, and then they publish. And once they've published, it's already been published. There's really no incentive to improve the technology further because incremental improvement doesn't always necessarily lead to a publishable paper. And at the same time as a technology matures, it gets stuck at some point that we call the translational gap, where there's not enough funding sources that can go into these type of technologies. And venture capitalists are usually too risk averse to underwrite the risk of putting capital into something at a research stage. It's also, there's really no vehicle for funding things that are at a translational stage because investors, they want equity or something like that. And usually scientists don't even know how to think about these things at that stage. The second aspect is network. So commercializing climate biotechnologies is a very network-intensive process. It requires quite an interdisciplinary approach. You need access to industry partners, other research collaborators, entrepreneurial talent, a community, a customer distribution network, and so on. And academics don't really have the time to be developing these networks when they're in the lab. So what we've been thinking about is the biggest, the way that we're looking at solving the funding issue is that we first have to make translational science a fundable asset. And what we've been using is the IP token framework that allows researchers to tokenize their research and split it up into several fractions to enable a distributed network of individuals, this can be literally anyone, to come in and co-fund the research together. So all of these contributors, they collectively underwrite the risk and take the risk together, enabling the scientists to receive funding. And at the same time, they also receive a governance stake in the intellectual property. So they can be much closer to the scientists, they can influence the scientific direction, and they can also decide on how to distribute royalties and proceeds that are derived from the intellectual property. The other framework that we're using is the decentralized autonomous organization framework. I really believe that this is the future of incentivizing networks. Networks exist all over the place, but I think there's another way that we can energize these networks further by providing an incentive for good behavior. So what we've been doing we've developed this network of stakeholders that can directly engage and support the academic in return for token emissions. And both of these work sort of symbiotically. So on one hand, you enable a distributed stakeholder network to co-fund and co-govern the research. And in return, this network receives exposure to the success of that academic research project. And what we've seen is that these network stakeholders that we've built keep continuously coming back and wanting to support more because there's a much clearer incentive for them to do exactly that. So a little bit on the ecosystem design. So from a, let's say from a traditional protocol, like blockchain protocol design, you have the developers, the protocol, and the users. The developers in our case is the network stakeholders. And what they do is they govern the ValleyDAO protocol, and they vote on which research project ultimately get funding. In return for the funding to the academic researchers, who are our users, the academic researchers, like ValleyDAO becomes a co-owner of the intellectual property of that researcher. And then as the research has conducted the work and developed IP, the network stakeholders can continuously support that researcher in commercializing their work in return for further token emissions. And our progress so far is that we've built a stakeholder network of 43 active contributors. And an active contributor is somebody who contributes at least 2 hours of their time on a weekly basis. We funded up to 300,000 in academic research using this model through this distributed network. We've leveraged this network to also support the commercialization of IP at an academic lab and supported that lab in raising an additional $1 million in startup funding. And we've also helped another spin out in securing a customer deal of $100,000. And this significantly reduced their investment risk, basically. So now investors are really looking and are really interested in this startup, given that it has been able to demonstrate its technology in a real world use case. And then finally, we've been able to actually capture value through the network by turning ValleyDAO into sort of like an intelligence network. So the stakeholder network is a network that that has like a wide reach. It's consisting of contributors who know a lot of different researchers, and thus they can source different technologies. So BioRem, for example, they're focusing on biofiltration systems, and they actually reached out to us and asked if we could help them source a piece of technology and help them find a researcher that they can help, that they can work with. And just a couple of portfolio highlights. So the first project that we funded was with Imperial College London. This project focuses on biomanufacturing of food oils. And the food oil we're particularly interested in is palm oil. So as you might know, palm oil is quite a climate heavy type of oil where you have to plow down rainforest, and it's like monoculture, and you have to ship it across the globe and so on. With biomanufacturing, you can produce these lipids using organisms anywhere in the world that you have access to sugar, water, and steel. And this project was sourced by community members, it was reviewed by community members, and finally voted on and funded by the community. And now this research is tokenized and governable on-chain, so the community has a sort of like a say in how the IP is later commercialized, how it's licensed, under what conditions, and for example, how any proceeds are distributed. Another project that we've been working with has been with Denmark's Technical University. They're focusing on these so-called forever chemicals that you might have heard of in the news. It's really difficult to replace these chemicals because they have certain material properties that you can't find elsewhere. And what they've done is they've developed an alternative bio-based material to these chemicals without the harmful climate impact. So the community in this case sort of acted like a decentralized venture studio, so helping them everything with team formation, developing a viable business model, and then finally fundraising. And the third project here is that we're in preparation, that we're currently preparing with Harvard University, focuses on how we can improve photosynthesis. So right now, photosynthesis is a very energy inefficient process. So approximately only 1% of the sun's energy is actually converted into biomass, into food. And what Dr. Elizabeth Hahn has been working on for the last 4 or 5 years is sort of like a system that combines electrochemistry with biology to increase the energy efficiency by up to 4 times. So this project will be tokenized, fractionalized, and then people will be able to buy fractions of these projects to ultimately fund it.
You're working with some really prestigious universities and obviously some very competent scientists. So what is it about these scientists or these faculties, I suppose, within these universities that made them so excited to work with a DeSci protocol?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and a question we keep asking ourselves, actually. I think a lot of scientists, they all know about these problems that we've been talking about in this room. They're all frustrated in some shape or form. They're all tired of the same old. With this funding model, like, we can reduce the time of them actually receiving funding. So it's a simpler process, and we're pretty fast at letting them know that, hey, you're going to receive funding here or not. So we're shortening the time window for the decision. Another aspect, especially with George Church, for example, like, he's sort of always been an experimentalist. Like, I think he is part of I think he's part of your board, perhaps, exactly. So he knows what DeSci is, and I think he just generally finds it interesting. And we strategically started working with him because we believe that we believe, like, for this to gain adoption, we need stronger network effects. So by choosing the right researchers to work with, we can also set examples for future researchers.
This was great, thanks. Can you maybe talk a little bit about the differences and similarities between what you guys are doing and what Molecule is doing?
Yeah, so Molecule is the provider of the IP token framework. So they provide the infrastructure in that sense, and we apply the infrastructure. So you can sort of see us as a DApp on Molecule's infrastructure. Molecule doesn't fund science directly. They provide the conditions for the creation of organizations that can fund science.
I'm also curious about how this funding works that you mentioned, and also what you said for these IP tokens. I'm not really familiar much with that, but like, is it like investment of people, or do they get something for it, or how does it work? Or you want me to ask you this on a lunch break?
No, I'm comfortable to answer this. So people receive governance rights in the intellectual property. The intellectual property, I would say, is it's like the secret sauce. It's the most important thing in a scientific endeavor that is looking to be commercialized into a product. In an ideal world, we would give them like direct ownership, but given the current regulatory framework, like, you cannot, do that in a smooth way. We also we're betting on improved regulations in this regard, so that people can actually receive direct payout in the future when things starts maturing and gets turned into a real product. But that's nothing that people have been against, that not receiving direct ownership. For the people that have funded like some of our research projects so far, they're just excited to be supporting things that can create a better world, right? And crypto is a pretty good industry to position scientific funding, because on one hand it's high risk because you're starting at the earliest stage, right? But what we've seen is like investors in crypto, they also have a higher risk tolerance. So there's a good matching there. If this is gonna be the case in the future, don't really know as the crypto industry starts maturing. But yeah.